talk,
identity,
and access
management.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How's it going?
I'm good, and you?
I'm good. I'm excited. My LinkedIn. I've been getting a lot of network requests. So, connecting with a lot of people who listen to the show, and it's just great to network and make connections with people in our industry. And I'd like to, I know we've said this a few times, but I want to be very clear, completely open to networking with people who are in the industry or just listening to the show. I mean, I can't imagine many people listen to the show if they're not involved in the identity management industry. I mean, it is pretty focused, but yeah, I mean, Jim McDonald, easy to find on LinkedIn.
Yep, we have our LinkedIn profiles in the show notes usually, so we're there. And you can also find us on identityatthecenter.com, that sort of thing. It is cool to get, LinkedIn connection requests, from people who find us however they find us. I've noticed certainly an uptick over the last few days since the episode that we recorded with David Douay I guess it went live this Monday, depending on when you're listening to it. It would have been Monday, the 28th of September. But I've seen a lot of kind of international requests coming through, which is always very cool. And it's, we're all kind of on the same team and trying to figure out, IAM in our own respective ways. So, the more heads you can put together against a problem, I think the better. So that is certainly very, very cool.
Yeah, for anyone who hasn't listened to that episode with David, I highly recommend it. I mean, the guy's well connected, but one of the things that I love, and we've had a lot of guests who are, plowing their own personal time and energy, life energy back into the industry to help the IAM practitioner, to help, mature our industry. And he's somebody who has put in more than his share of work. So extra props out to David. I know he's a regular listener as well.
Yeah, that is pretty cool. So hats off to him and to other organizations and people that are kind of contributing their time and sometimes their money, right, towards kind of furthering things without really expecting anything in return. So that's always really neat. And, things like that are what we look at and try to, look up when we're doing research, in our own personal lives and things like that. It's just cool. Also want to give a shout out because we made the bibliography section of the ID Pro .org website. So they're an organization that I think I've mentioned in the past that focuses on identity and access management. I'm a member of it and noticed the other day that we've been listed on the bibliography. So that is pretty darn cool. So I'm happy about that.
I think that's very cool, and shout out to them for what they're doing for the industry as well, and hopefully we can have somebody from their organization on the podcast soon.
Yeah, that would be cool. And obviously they have great taste, selecting this podcast to be part of that. So, kudos to them on that wise choice for sure. What do you think about getting into today's topic? I think we're going to talk around getting inside the identity governance and administration, or IGA, sales cycle. And to help with that, we've got Mary Berg, who is the Vice President of Channels and Alliances with CloudBridge. Welcome to the show, Mary.
Hi, thank you for having me. This is delightful.
Thanks for joining us. So one of the first questions that we like to ask all of our guests is how they got into the wonderful world of identity and access management. Is it something that you picked, or did IAM pick you?
IAM picked me. At the time I fell into identity, I was with Dell as a systems engineer, and they kept acquiring companies, and they acquired Quest. And every time they acquired a product that they didn't know what to do with it, they would throw it to the enterprise SEs. So I jumped in head first when I got into all the identity products they had to offer. And from there, I guess I was hooked because I went to Centrify, which at that point in time was largely access management as well as directory management. Then I spent a couple of years at SailPoint and got into the governance side of it. And from there, I spent a couple of years with Omada, who takes a kind of a different tact. I also spent a short time working with Savient. So I've worked with a lot of the major players and therefore a lot of partners of the major players. So I have a pretty good view of this stuff and I'm definitely hooked on it.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. And you can't help from being in your position, kind of forming a perspective. And that's one of the things we always like to do with this show is have guests who have a perspective. And so what I'd like to do is throw a question to you, which is, what are your thoughts on some of the new players that are coming into this IGA market? Well, one of the things that I see is kind of a increased focus on the SMB or small to mid-sized business space. And what are your thoughts there? What are you seeing happening? Because I think this is kind of going to change the future of the vendor space and kind of what it looks like a couple years down the road.
I think it's an absolute trend that's happening. I think for years, organizations, the large players, the ones in the leaders quadrant for Gartner, for IGA, those guys really turned away and couldn't fulfill on the expectations of small to medium enterprises. Generally, from both the acquisition costs as well as the ability to put it in place. They need those larger solutions, need organizations that can provide consulting services around it and a long-term hand-holding approach. So I think we're seeing in the market right now companies popping up that have clearly taken the time to look at the needs of the end users in the small to medium enterprise space. Two of them come to mind. One of them is actually a 15-year-old startup. They started as a consulting organization, and one of their CTO, for example, goes all the way back to Sun with their identity plays. And he really came forward with the whole concept of identity maybe shouldn't be centralized. Maybe there should be a guardian at the center, but empower those managers, for example, whoever runs sales, whoever's running support, whoever's running any given finance, should be empowered to give access and the appropriate access to the end users. And that's a little company called SAF ID Hub. Very different approach. Another player in that space is Secure Ends, and they worked collaboratively with Deloitte to come up with an incredible interface that's highly appealing, highly adaptable to the end user in terms of their ability to use it quickly. They started out in a small to medium enterprise space, doing incredibly well this year, and they've suddenly branched out into enterprise as well. So I think they're going to have one of the most scalable solutions in the marketplace. The third new entry is it's a new approach to IGA altogether in the sense of they're doing the traditional governance functions, but they're relying on ServiceNow, which most major organizations have, as the means of getting requests in and out. And I think it's a brilliant strategy. I think it puts them in a slightly different audience than the previous two I talked about. But it's really clear that people are now receptive to a new approach, as well as the vendors who represent those new approaches.
Yeah, one thing that I've also seen is that kind of the breaking down of with these companies that focus on that small to mid-size enterprise, they're not restricting themselves just to IGA, but they're also trying to bundle in single sign-on and privileged access management. So it's a more comprehensive approach. So one company that I've looked at in the past is called Atlantis. We had their CEO on the show a while back. Jeff, I'm not sure if you can maybe in the background pull up what that episode number for folks who are interested. He also has a long legacy in the industry, Binod Singh, and that it's just another example of these players that are not maybe the top of the chart in the Gartner space that are making some moves and making some noise and really able to address that segment of the market where a lot of the big players just don't put any focus, right?
Right.
Yeah, and that was episode 32, way back in February of 2020. Seems like ages ago. Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Secure Ends because I've seen them too, and I think that they've got a really interesting product, when it comes to, the usability interface. I think they're kind of an undiscovered secret still at this point. Definitely, a smaller player still considering, where they would potentially fall and try to compete against some of the bigger ones like SailPoint, Savient, Omada, others in that vein. But I've been impressed with what I've seen from them. I'm not as familiar with ID Hub, and I do have some familiarity with ClearSky, which is another great product. And, Atlantis is great too. It's interesting to see the focus on the small and mid-sized business, because I felt for the longest time that was a weakness that the larger players had, similar to what you mentioned, Mary, around, not really being, that really wasn't what they were going to market, right? They were trying to land the big fish. Meanwhile, there's, tons of companies and opportunities out there in the IGA space for these smaller organizations that are, starting to outgrow the homegrown tools, or maybe just, the built-in, Active Directory functions, things like that. And they have a need for identity governance for whatever reason, whether it's compliance or, security or audit or whatever it may be. And that's kind of been an underserved market. And, I'm starting to see SailPoint and, others start to look at that area. But I think this is an opportunity for some of those smaller companies that maybe aren't as well known to step in and kind of grow with these smaller mid-sized businesses as they grow themselves. So I think it's an interesting play. When it comes to the integration between IGA and tools like ServiceNow, right? IT service management, ClearSky is a vendor that has built very heavily on the ServiceNow platform and integrates very well. And you've got other products that have other types of leverages into service management products. What are you kind of seeing from your perspective when it comes to those integrations? Is it more along the lines of people trying to integrate directly with their ITSM tool, or are you still seeing kind of that separate play where IGA is IGA and ITSM is ITSM?
So I think the obvious answer is that IGA and ITSM have been moving toward each other for a long time. And most of the major IGA players have taken the approach of integrating with the ITSM players like ServiceNow, and not fully creating a solution that's truly friendly in terms of empowering enterprises to get the best out of both solutions. I think that's a very different approach than ClearSky is doing, which is ClearSky is going to do governance on top of basically using ServiceNow as a transport layer. And I think that's brilliant, because then there's not that fight internally in an organization when they go back out their identity solution as to what should be happening with what tool. Hey, we've got ServiceNow, it works. Why do we need some of the same functionality in an IGA solution, in terms of the request functions?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me as well. So I think that you hit the point spot on, right? Is that organizations for a long time, as long as I've been doing this consulting, are saying, our people are already used to going to ServiceNow or whatever their ITSM solution is. We don't want to send them somewhere else. And so the approach has been, traditionally, at least that in my mind, has been take the ITSM, use it as the front end, and either do a heavy integration or at least link out, hey, here's where you click for cyber access, and it brings you to the IGA solution. But having a more fully integrated, environment makes sense from an end user perspective, and from an IT side of the house, or the IAM team side of the house, it shouldn't have to be rocket science to integrate the IGA with the ITSM platform. So I still think that this doesn't give you the answer on whether or not go with a traditional IGA vendor or something that's built into the ITSM that you're on, but just more or less the approach, which has to be that you have to take the user experience into account and determine whether or not it makes sense that for your organization, are your users already kind of trained to go to your ITSM to request things, and should your cyber access also be a part of that environment.
I feel like this is one of those holy wars that takes place in identity and access management. There's two main holy wars that I can think of that always come up at some point within an organization. First is, where are non-employees going to be managed? Do they go in the HR system or not? And that's typically the first holy war, is where are you going to manage those people who are not employees? And then the second one is, okay, now we've got an IGA tool and we have an ITSM tool, which is going to be the front end for access requests. Early on in my career, I was probably more diehard on IGA is built for this. It has all the features and functionalities that we're looking for from a identity governance perspective. Why would we try to shim that into an ITSM tool that is not built for that? Now, this was 15 years ago, roughly, and ITSM tools didn't really take identity governance as part of their purview, but a lot has changed over that time. And my thinking on this has evolved to, I don't care. As long as somebody is using, the tools that have been put in place and that they're following the right governance, whatever makes the most sense, for the organization to consume those IAM services, is totally up to them to make the decision on when they, where they want to kind of house that request process.
Yeah. I think, Jeff, to add to that, it's not the same answer in every organization. So someone might be listening and they might be the IAM professional within an organization. They're heavily using ITSM, and it's like, it's a black and white. It's like we've put so much investment into ITSM. Other organizations, it's not quite as clear cut. So going directly to using IGA, or maybe if IGA is kind of replacing some other identity administration tool, getting that leverage or benefit off of ITSM hasn't been the way that they've channeled users in the past, and so it's not as critical of an issue. But I think you're right. I think you hit on probably the two biggest holy wars, and that's what we see coming up very, very often in almost every account. Mary, do you have any thoughts on that whole topic?
I do. I have several. One, I think that the very nature of the size and ability for an organization to support itself, and by that I really do mean identity security, and the traditional network team overseeing servers, networks, etc. When you're a small to medium business, you're in that 50 to maybe 750 employee range, you're way off the radar of the big players. And what that means is, I don't have the money to afford an identity specialist, but that doesn't mean that I don't care about all of the things that should be taking place in an identity system: controlling access, responding to requests, moving people's roles around when they do change teams. What do you do when you terminate them? Who's going to make sure that happens? They have the same needs, but they don't have the ability to staff up. So some of these innovative solutions directly appeal to that. And I think when you look at the ServiceNow aspect for a small to medium business, ServiceNow will scale down fairly well, but they're also doing some fairly primitive things in the small to medium space on that level. So some of the decision making that's going to happen is, exactly as one of you said, based on the organization itself.
Absolutely. So, Mary, with your background in kind of these sales leadership roles in so many different companies, one of the things that we wanted to bring to our listening audience is some perspective on, the IAM sales cycle from the sales side. So, I've never been in a sales role. I'm always interested to understand, okay, how do salespeople kind of approach the deal and working with customers and knowing they're competing? And one of the other angles I'd like to throw at this, right, is that you've also worked with companies in different stages of their life cycle, from those that are kind of trending up and those that are trending down in terms of kind of their market presence, as well as kind of at the pinnacle of being in the lead. So kind of wondering, from your perspective, what are some things that you think are educational that our listeners who are maybe on the buying side of the house ought to know about the sales cycle, and how they're being thought of and how they're being approached and how they can basically get the most out of that sales cycle, I think is kind of one of the biggest takeaways that we'd like to have.
I think the first thing I'd like to say about the sales cycle and identity is it's generally long. And that's generally because there's actually kind of some diametrically opposed goals between salespeople and their customers. As a salesperson, I need to sell you my product that has a set of features. And on the other hand, if I'm the consumer, I may have a set of needs that don't directly map to what you're selling me. I think the biggest thing that happens in the sales cycle, and it's on both sides, is really determining priorities. And it has to be based on the organization or the prospect, if you will, and what they're really trying to accomplish. If their sole reason for looking at identity solutions is access requests, as an example, there are companies that really focus on that aspect and that aspect alone. If they have more complex needs, there's always two sources to buy from in this market. One is the vendor themselves, and the other is through an organization which provides not just the sale of the product, but pre-sales advisory, meaning they're going to help you look at a suite of solutions that fit your specified needs. Those organizations are out there. Yes, they still want to sell, but they're your better shot at getting advice that's not limited to, I have this need, but you want to sell me that. I think that's the number one thing I would point out about the sales cycle.
I think that's kind of interesting because that's not something that a lot of vendors will kind of point out, right? Is they're obviously trying to sell you their specific product. And I think one thing that gets lost sometimes is when you're working through a third party, whether it's consulting firm or something else, is there is this viewpoint that, well, they're just trying to sell me a product, right? What products do they partner with, and how to they're trying to influence my decision on that side. So it's very difficult to be vendor neutral and vendor agnostic in those types of scenarios. I know that Jim and I in our day lives, right, when we're not doing a podcast, we work on an advisory services consulting firm, and we try to be as vendor neutral as possible and take that into an account. Whereas if you're working directly with the company, there's always that idea that they're going to push their product on me, and they're going to say they can do a whole bunch of things that they can't do. And it's a little bit of the marketing fluff that kind of gets out there. What I think is interesting also is from the pricing perspective and trying to get the best deal possible. There's things out there that people should consider when it comes to how to negotiate with vendors. Some of the things that have come top of mind for me, example, are what is it end of quarter? Is it end of year? You're typically going to get better pricing, those times where salespeople are trying to hit quotas, goals, targets, whatever you want to call them. So a common one is like, if you can be in a position to buy, December 31st, then you're probably going to get a better price than you would January 1st, right? So a lot of times we're trying to take advantage of cycles like that, right, to get the kind of the most bang for the buck when it comes to licensing. Are there, does that line up with kind of what you see from how to negotiate from a pricing perspective when it comes to strategy, as if you were sitting in the buyer's seat? Or are there other things that people should consider?
Yes, it's completely true. I would say there's several things, and this goes back a little bit, but if you're looking at identity, try and develop your actual set of needs and requirements as fully as possible. If you feel it's still vague, then you need an advisory service to come in and help you make those more real. And they should be things which truly impact your business. When it comes to negotiation, please go back to that list, because it's a little like buying a car. You will have said the things important to me are that it's a 6-cylinder engine, that it's got a certain brand of tires on it, and that I really like the way it does the backup lighting for me. My advice is, when you do look at proposals, make sure they're descriptive in terms of what's included. Question anything in terms of wording that you don't understand. Beware of things like modular pricing and platform fees, because you need to understand what you're buying. And sometimes the proposals can be a little daunting. And ask your vendor or your consulting partner or whatever source you're buying through to put it in layman's terms, which will help you get your approvals. Too many times, whoever's selling the IGA solution is used to talking to technically minded people just like them. So they can have a lovely conversation about the nits and gnats of the solution. But when it goes up level to get the approvals for financial funding of the acquisition of the software and the services needed to put it in place, those people won't understand the proposal. So ask your vendor to put it in English and what you're going to be able to accomplish, and then you'll get clearer proposals.
No, I think that's fantastic advice, Mary. So, one thing I would ask is if we have listeners who are like, wow, that was some good advice, I need more. Would they have the opportunity then to reach out to you on LinkedIn, or how could people reach you for, to bounce ideas off of you?
They can reach me on LinkedIn. My profile name is Mary Berg, but it's actually the suffix of the link is Mary Berg Broyles, Broyles. Or you could reach me more easily at mary.berg@cloudbridgeplatform.com, and I'll answer you personally. I'd be happy to help anybody. It's tough sometimes getting through the world of IGA and really determining what your immediate need is versus the big picture. And I think that's the area I kind of have great vision in, and I'm glad to help organizations make some choices that will help them get further faster.
Well, that's a fantastic offer. And that's, again, kind of one of our goals that Jeff and I started out with this podcast was around building a community and connecting people. So for anyone who's listening, again, kind of, connect in with Jeff and I, connect in with our guests. Mary just gave kind of the offer, so take her up on it. Mary, one thing that we like to do with all of our guests is understand what they do to sharpen the saw. And what I mean by sharpen the saw is what are the things that you're doing to, continue to improve your professional presence, improve your life, whatever it may be. What are some tidbits or some nuggets of things that you found that maybe other people haven't found that you can tell us about and we can go and explore?
So I'm a huge proponent of LinkedIn. I'm on a bunch of the identity related groups. I'm on some automation groups. I'm on big data groups. Also, I'm a big fan of Meetup. Meetup is a group which allows networking groups inside of it. Virtually every city in this country has an identity or an IAM meetup group. I think they're one of the best forums that I know of where you can, right now, we're doing them by online meeting services, depending on the city. But normally they meet in person. They have presenters, and it's an amazing way to meet the identity professionals in your city. I can't stress that enough. These are the same people having the same challenges as you are, whether you're in Atlanta, Chicago, Kansas City, Austin, Texas, doesn't matter. And it's a great way to socialize, hear a speaker talk, usually on a non-commercial topic, which is great. Ask questions and you'll get a lot of ideas from it. And that's a great source of local knowledge.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the meetups too. I think that's something that gets overlooked. It's a kind of a cool community, right? You get to kind of know the local people in the IAM space around you. In the Chicago area, for example, they typically meet downtown, some point, and people kind of come from all over and kind of share or commiserate based on where they're at from a rollout perspective or just from an operational perspective. So I like that suggestion. So I think we've left it at a pretty good spot at this point. Mary, are there any other parting words of wisdoms that you want to throw out there for the listening audience?
I think if you're relying on a partner, you need to get to know the partner. And by that, I mean, don't just buy into a relationship without really understanding who they are, what they can do. And it's an awkward question to ask, but ask if they have limitations in a certain area that you have a requirement about. But it's better to have that conversation up front rather than getting further down the project, having thought you've got exactly who you need to work with. That's my only last part of advice is try to make sure that the organizations you work with really know how to provide the services that you need.
That's a good idea. Jim, anything that you want to close out with?
No, I think along those lines as well, though, I think even beyond just kind of the capabilities, you want to partner with organizations that have a stake in your success. So I think, you want to meet the leadership team, you want to believe in the people, and you want to know that you're going to register as important enough to them. If you don't, you're just going to kind of be one of the, just another logo on a slide, and that's not good enough. Some organization out there is going to see you as very special and very important. They're going to give you an opportunity to influence their roadmap, and to me, that means a lot. That relationship side of things means a lot. Also, like on the people side, like being able to have the phone numbers of people who are higher up in the organization. I mean, if you're important enough, I think even most of the time CEOs will pay a visit, and you'll have a way to contact them, their email address or their phone number. I mean, to me, that I want to, as a buyer, I want to know that I'm going to be very important to that organization.
Yeah, I think that's, good words of wisdom from both of you. I mean, it's very rare that I come across a company that is not interested in making their customers successful. So you would hope that, products and services that are out there, they'll take the time to make sure that, they're doing the right thing just from a people perspective, right? And a relationship perspective. But if you're not seeing that, that can be a red flag, to keep an eye out for, even if it is something where you've got a dirt cheap product price, but you're not seeing the support on the business side of things, take that into consideration, because, that could be a warning sign that there might be potential issues down the road. So I think that's a good spot for us to go ahead and wrap it up for this episode. Mary, appreciate your time and being able to join us. Jim, always great to talk with you as well. And for the folks who are listening, appreciate all those listeners out there, and feel free to connect with any or all of us on LinkedIn. I'll have links in the show notes like usual, where you can check things out that we've mentioned here as part of the discussion. And you can find us in your favorite podcast app as you're listening now. Find us at identityatthecenter.com. We're on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. And I think with all of that self-promotion, we'll go ahead and leave it right there. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk with everyone in the next one. You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. For more episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.